Appropriate message given that tomorrow is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, because we're dealing in the book of Acts with Paul and the legal system and the unjust charges that he is facing. So it reminded me of a question that has been part of church history for centuries, and that is, what's the difference between a reformer and a rebel? And many of the great figures in church history set out to be one and ended up being the other, not necessarily by choice, but by the way that events unfolded. People like John Wycliffe or Jan Hus. I've spoken of him before. Jan wanted to reform the Bohemian church and had a hearing before the Holy Roman Emperor to talk about what the problems were that he wanted addressed. And instead of having a fair hearing, he was tried for heresy and burned at the stake. A couple generations later, Martin Luther started out as a reformer, not as a revolutionary, but ended up becoming a rebel because his effort was thwarted. And then during World War II, the German pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a man that sought to keep the church from becoming polluted by the Nazis. And when he saw that had failed because Nazi officials were at the head of the German Lutheran church, he decided to form a competing church, a separate church. And that was a very bold step. In the end, that involvement in that bit of rebellion led to his arrest and imprisonment and death. And then in American history, just a few decades ago, during the Civil Rights Movement, there was much talk and much conversation in the church in America today about how one should go about challenging laws that seem to be unjust. How does one go against the system without violating the edicts of Romans 13:1 or other passages of Scripture? How does one act in such cases? What about civil disobedience? Is that a path? What about nonviolent protest? I wasn't around for it, but I know that during the time of the civil rights protests, there were many Christian ministers and theologians that thought that the acts, the things that the civil rights people were doing were unchristian, that they were pushing it too far, that they were not working within the system. And then, of course, there were others saying that this is the right way to go about it. And it was an interesting and difficult debate because it's not easy to tell how we should react to government authority when that authority is unjust or immoral. And so let's look today at Acts chapter 25. We're going to see Paul before the Roman governor Festus and how he interacts and deals with the situation that he's in, and hopefully it'll help us in this ongoing conversation within the church. So let's look at verse 1 and 2 of Acts 25. It says this: 3 days after arriving in the province, Festus went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem, where the chief priests and the Jewish leaders appeared before him and presented the charges against Paul. This is 3 days after Festus arrives to become governor. The year is 60 A.D. Festus will be governor from 60 until 62, not because he was a poor governor, but because he died while holding the position. He was a much better governor than Felix, the man that we dealt with in Acts chapter 24 last week. Felix was replaced and forced to resign, really the end of his career, because of how poorly he handled the province. The next two governors after Festus were, according to historians, basically villains. They were vain, they were greedy, they were not good men in any way, and they led toward the disastrous rebellion of AD 66. When this chapter begins, we are only 6 years before the beginning of the rebellion in the province of Judea against Rome. The rebellion that will end 4 years later with the destruction of Jerusalem and the death of the last rebels on Masada. So it is a very volatile time, although Festus is going to try to make things better. So 3 days after he arrives, he goes from Caesarea up to Jerusalem to meet with the officials there. He understood that if he was going to govern this province and have any hope of having peace here, that he needed to be on good terms with the leadership in Jerusalem. He needed to make relationships and build that with them. And so he goes and tries to make things better. He meets with, it says, the chief priests. We are now have a different chief priest. Ananias is no longer the chief priest. He was when this case against Paul began 2 years ago, but he's not anymore. He's been replaced. Herod Agrippa II had the right to appoint the high priest, and he changed from Ananias to Ishmael. Ananias will remain an important figure, however, because he's still alive and still pushing things behind the scenes. Interestingly enough, when the rebellion begins in AD 66, the Jewish nationalists will find Ananias in his home and murder him there as a collaborator with Rome. So the chief priests, which would be Ishmael and Ananias, they bring the charges against Paul. And it makes me wonder, right? This is their first meeting with this new Roman governor. There must be a bunch of things to talk about, right? All sorts of economic and social and law things to deal with. And yet, at this very first meeting, one of their most important things, evidently, was to continue the case against Paul, because they bring it up at that first meeting. They want to make sure it moves forward. So what are they going to ask of Festus? It says they requested Festus, as a favor to them, have Paul transferred to Jerusalem, for they were preparing an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus answered, Paul's being held at Caesarea, and I myself am going there soon. Let some of your leaders come with me, and if the man has done anything wrong, they can press charges against him there. Now, they know Festus needs to be on good relations with them, and so they ask for a favor. And it seems like not a big deal, right? This is change of venue. Change of venue happens in court cases when it moves from one jurisdiction to another if there's an issue. And so they're basically just saying, this case is being tried in Caesarea, just bring it back to Jerusalem, try it here. No big deal, just a small favor. Of course, they are planning to kill Paul on the way. That's the same plan that they had 2 years ago. Before his original trial was going to take place, they wanted to kill him. They're not willing to let the legal system work itself out. They want to murder Paul. That's how badly they want him gone. However, Festus wants to be accommodating, but he also can't allow himself to be a pushover. This is a Roman citizen at the provincial capital in Caesarea, already in custody there. He can't exactly bring this man back to Jerusalem. It would seem like he was giving too much, I think. And so he says, if you want him tried, just come to me, and we'll make it happen. We'll see what's going on. So they acquiesce. After spending 8 or 10 days with them, Festus went down to Caesarea. The next day he convened the court and ordered that Paul be brought before him. When Paul came in, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. They brought many serious charges against him, but they couldn't prove them. So after 8 or 10 days of dealing with all of the issues that they had to deal with, he goes back to Caesarea, and the very next day convenes the court case against Paul. This does not wait for 6 months or even 6 weeks. The very next day, they start the case against Paul. We're not wasting any time. This is an important case. Although Festus understands that it's important to the Jewish leaders, but I don't think he has any knowledge as to why this is important yet. They bring many serious charges against Paul. They're throwing everything at Paul, trying to make something stick. Luke doesn't even bother to tell us all of the different things they accused Paul of, all of the things they tried to make stick. But they couldn't prove them. I think it's probably because, if you remember during the Gospels, when there were the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin in the dead of night, there were false witnesses that spoke against Jesus and lied about what he had done or said. partly because they knew that the Sanhedrin was not going to punish them for lying. But this is the Roman governor at the provincial capital. If you go there and tell a story, that's not going to go well for you. So I doubt they could find people to lie. So they're just making accusations without proof. So Paul's going to make a defense against that. It says, then Paul made his defense. I've done nothing wrong against the Jewish law or against the temple or against Caesar. Paul could see that the case against him was weak, that there was no proof, so he just makes a simple defense. I haven't done anything wrong. He speaks about the Jewish law and the temple. Those matter to Festus, but they're not his area of control. He's not in charge of the Jewish law or Jewish temple precinct, so it's not really his area. Although he would care, of course, because trouble there could lead to a riot. But Paul also says, I've done nothing against Caesar. No, in other words, no civil infractions, no religious infractions. I haven't done anything. And that's the whole defense. Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Festus floats the idea that the high priest had given him before. Now, I don't think this is in any way an immoral idea from Festus. He doesn't understand that they want to kill Paul on the way. He doesn't understand this whole process. Maybe he thinks that if we go up to Jerusalem, we can get to the bottom of this, because he doesn't see an answer to this case here. But he wasn't willing to turn Paul over to them. Festus understood enough to know that he had to maintain control of this trial, that he had to be in charge. However, Paul's not going to allow this. He says, Paul answered, I'm standing before Caesar's court where I ought to be tried. I've not done anything but wrong to the Jews, as you yourself know very well. If, however, I'm guilty of doing anything deserving death, I don't refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by these Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. And here's where the book of Acts takes a sharp turn. Paul says, we are in Caesar's court. He's trying to appeal to Festus's pride as a Roman. You are the governor. This is your court. Why would we move somewhere else? And I think it's interesting here. We're seeing Paul act and how he reacts to this circumstance. We know that the charges against him are entirely bogus. He hasn't done anything wrong. And yet he's not lashing out. He's simply using the system that exists, using the rights that he has as a Roman citizen, and speaking the truth. He's not doing anything outrageous. He's not fighting fire with fire. He's not responding to a one punch with a harder punch. He's not doing anything like that. He's simply speaking his own defense and using the truth. Paul says, my best defense is that everybody can tell that I'm innocent. You know very well that I'm innocent. There's nobody that can prove otherwise. Paul did not come into this hearing defying Roman authority, sticking his chest out and saying, you have no right to charge me. Who are you? He didn't do that. He simply said, if I have done anything wrong, then that's fine. But I haven't. And then he says, no one has the right to hand me over to them. No one has the right. This is interesting because Paul is a Roman citizen. Not that many people were, but he was a Roman citizen, and so he uses his rights. He didn't say, I refuse to exercise my rights. He didn't bring his rights to the forefront of the case, but he simply said, no one has the right to hand me over to them. Obviously, he's not going to get a fair trial if he goes before the Sanhedrin. So he says, I appeal to Caesar. In Latin, that's provocatio ad Caesarem. In other words, the appeal to Caesar. It was the right of any Roman citizen on trial in one of the provinces. If you're not in Italy itself, if you're in any of the provinces, you had the right as a citizen to appeal to the imperial court if you could claim that you were trying to be coerced, that there was a threat of violence or money or something that was changing hands that was making it so you couldn't get a fair trial, or if it was a capital crime. In this case, that's true for Paul. Both of those are true. Paul is being pressured. He knows that they're trying to kill him without the legal proceedings, and they want the death penalty for him. So he appeals to Caesar. The Caesar at this time is actually Nero. And you might be thinking, well, that's not good. Don't appeal to Nero. The guy's nuts. But at this point, the Stoic philosopher Seneca was still alive. And Seneca was a good influence on Nero. At this point in history, he was not the madman that he would be in just a couple of years. He had not started persecuting the Christians of Rome. Of course, that community might not even be founded yet. So he's not the guy he would be. Paul doesn't have any reason not to appeal to Caesar, but he makes this claim. He uses his own rights as a citizen. And I find that instructive for us in this day and age as we try to decide how, as Christians, should we respond to society, to culture, to the government, if we see injustice, if we see an issue, if we are trying to be reformers instead of rebels. Use the rights that we have. Work within the system as it exists. Speak the truth even if it doesn't seem like it's working. And so it says, after Festus had conferred with his council, he declared, "You have appealed to Caesar you will go." It's not about the right to appeal that Festus talks to his counselors, because that's an absolute right. As the governor, he doesn't have the right to say, your appeal to Caesar is denied, you can't go. He wouldn't do that. The question is, can I just let him go right now? Can I declare him innocent, put an end to the trial, and then I don't have to send him to Rome? That was the question, but he didn't feel he had the right to do that. Remember, he just arrived. He doesn't understand what's going on within Judea. What is this fight about? Who is who, right? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? Who are Rome's enemies? Who are Rome's friends? He can't make a decision like that and let a man go free that all of these people are accusing of all of these things. And so really, Festus has no choice but to send Paul to Rome. One last thing before he sends him, however, and that is King Agrippa. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. Since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, "There's a man whom Felix left as prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests, the elders of the Jews, brought charges against him and asked that he be condemned." This is King Agrippa. He's the great-grandson of Herod the Great. He was raised in Rome. He was a friend of the soon-to-be emperor Claudius back in the day. He was born in AD 27. He's going to live to 100. He is here at Caesarea paying respects to Festus because he's been appointed the ruler of a little slice of territory just north of the province of Judea that Festus is governor of. So naturally, he comes to the neighbor to show his respects. And he wants to discuss, Festus wants to discuss the case with Agrippa. Two very good reasons. Number one, Agrippa was the curator of the temple. That was his official title that Claudius had given him when he was emperor. It meant that he was the one that now had the power to appoint the high priest. He had the power to control the temple treasury. Basically, he had some administrative oversight of the temple. So if this is a case revolving around Judaism, then he might have something to say about it. And also because the Roman authorities considered Agrippa to be an authority on Judaism, someone that they could turn to when they didn't understand what the Jews were arguing about. They could say, "Hey, Agrippa, what's the issue here? What's going on?" Because Agrippa's mother was an extremely devout Jewish person, and he was known to have been raised in a home like that, so they figured he would know what's going on. Here's what Festus tells Agrippa. I told them it's not the Roman custom to hand over anyone before they've faced their accusers and had an opportunity to defend themselves against the charges. When they came here with me, I didn't delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. Notice, Festus is a good man. We don't know a lot about him, but he's a good man. He doesn't violate the rights and the customs. He gives Paul an opportunity to defend himself. He's trying to do the right thing here. He says when his accusers got up to speak, they didn't charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus, who Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters. Here we see what had happened previously in the charges that left Festus so confused. They didn't come to him with a civil crime. They didn't come to Festus and say, Paul is a revolutionary, Paul is a troublemaker, Paul hates Rome. All of the things that he would have expected. Instead, they were talking about theology, about the Messiah, and who is the Messiah, and what the legitimate Messiah would look like, and all of that stuff. In other words, they were arguing about Judaism. And Festus doesn't know anything about Judaism. He has no idea about these prophecies that they're talking about this Jesus that they're arguing about. And he gets the gist of it, right? They say that Jesus is dead. Paul says that he's alive. That's the heart of the question. That's the heart of the issue. But it makes no sense to him, right? Put yourself in Festus's shoes for a minute. Here you have two people arguing about whether someone's alive or not. That's weird, right? You're a governor trying to solve a legal case, and people are arguing about whether or not somebody's alive. And he is bewildered. He says, I was at a loss. How do I even start to unravel what these people are arguing about, why they hate Paul, and what's really going on? This is far beyond him. So I asked if he'd be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But when Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. So he sums it up and wraps that up, saying, I tried to go to Jerusalem, maybe it would work. That didn't work. And then he appealed to Caesar. It's out of his hands. A brief look at what Agrippa has to say. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I'd like to hear this man myself. He replied, tomorrow you will hear him. These issues touch on matters that are important to the temple, and so they're important to Agrippa, and I think also Agrippa wants to be important and useful, so he says, sure, let me talk to him. And then we have an amazing scene. The next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking military officers and the prominent men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. So this is not just Paul with the governor and his accusers. This is now everybody in the town of Caesarea that's important. You got Agrippa coming in dressed like a king with his retinue. You've got all the military officials in their uniforms. You got the prominent men of the city. It's become a big to-do, a big event. And here Paul is brought in to stand before Agrippa. We'll look at that defense before Agrippa next week. The last bit of introduction to finish the chapter, it says this. Festus said, King Agrippa, all who are present with us, you see this man. The whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. I found he'd done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. Here's little old Paul standing before this huge tribunal, and they says, look at the guy. Everybody in Jerusalem and a whole bunch of the Jewish community in Caesarea tell me that this guy is too dangerous to be allowed to live. There's just Paul standing there. It doesn't look like somebody that's that dangerous. And Festus says, I don't see what the big deal is. But here's my problem. I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore, I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation, I may have something to write. For I think it is unreasonable to send a prisoner on to Rome without specifying the charges against him. It's not as if Festus is going to say, Dear Emperor Nero, I'm sending you this man because he says somebody is alive, and they say this guy is dead. Why don't you solve it, right? He's not going to send the emperor a letter talking about a dispute about whether or not Jesus is alive or dead. That's not going to look good for Festus, right? I just appointed you governor, and this is the first thing you send me? He can't do that. So he says, I need to write him something. You've got to help me figure this out. Something that doesn't make Festus look stupid would be helpful, Agrippa, if you can do it, because that's not going to work. I can't send him like this. And so next week we'll see Agrippa's conversation with Paul, which is a very fascinating one. This is an interesting passage, and one that you read this, and I read it preparing for this message, and the lesson, the application doesn't just jump right out at you and say, oh, well, this is what I should tell everybody about that. But I think there are a few things for us to glean from this that we can put to use. And the first is this: not all questions have easy answers, and not all problems have straightforward solutions. We can learn this from Festus. Festus was put in an impossible situation where he had no idea what was going on. He didn't know who was telling him the truth. He didn't know what was right in this case. And so sometimes discretion can be the better part of valor. And I really don't see this very often in social media, where people say, you know what, this is a complicated issue, and I'm not sure what the answer is, so I'm just going to err on the side of the caution and say, I'm not sure. That's not what the comment section is for, right? The comment section is for, I'm right and you're wrong, and then for the response, no, I'm right and you're wrong. Not all problems have easy answers. There was not an easy answer in American history to the civil rights violations that were happening, particularly in the South, but in other places in the country as well. What was the answer for that? How do you confront that? There was no easy way to get through that. It took them time, and it took effort to find out the right path, just as it took Festus time to get through this troubling situation. Secondly, Paul wasn't adverse to working within the system and exercising his rights when necessary. Paul was a citizen. He acted as a citizen. He followed procedure. He worked the system as he could. And I think that also speaks to us this morning. Work with the rights that we have. We have many of them in the United States of America, more than any other civilization before us. We have more than enough opportunity to find the right path within our rights without having to resort to doing things beyond them. And then lastly, no matter what the controversies, no matter what the problems and issues that we face here on earth in society, whether we are capable of solving them or not, in the end, our ultimate appeal, our ultimate and final judge is not another human being. It's not what society thinks of us. It's not what we think of each other. Our final and true judge is absolutely the Lord God Almighty. And Paul understood that just as well as you and I. He appealed to Caesar, but he stood with a clean conscience before God. And ultimately, that is what means the most.